I'm here to invite the facilitators of the breakout groups to the podium. And we will summarize the discussions that took place this afternoon in the breakouts. First of all, thank you very much, all of you, for staying a bit late. We're running a bit late. And also, thank you for participating in all those discussions this afternoon. I was in the CCS market, compare and contrast US and Europe was very interesting, very insightful. I hope you all enjoyed your conversations. So we have summary slides. Yep. So I think I'll just invite facilitators to present for a few minutes, and then we have also Q&A part where you can ask questions from the group you didn't participate, or if you want to add anything from the group you did participate but didn't see your point, an important point in the summary. So I first would like to invite Per-Olof, Secretary General of the Zero Emissions Platform. He chaired the session on CDR. So that's the top. We're continuing with the same topic. So Per-Olof, you have maybe a few minutes to present.
Thank you. First, can you hear me? First, we have a problem. Andrei doesn't have a microphone. We have to have a microphone. So, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. Extremely urgent, extremely interesting discussion, so I'm really, really happy to be here. And we had a discussion on CDR frameworks in Europe. Let's see if anyone is still here. Can you raise your hand if you were in this group? Oh, great. Super. Super good. Very, very much energy in the air. Really good discussions. We had Paul Zakur, who from Carbon Count, who gave us a journey of what has happened in Europe and from the UNFCCC perspective up until today. And we described where we are today. And let's see, do we have a slide? Yes, so the first slide, very quickly, the role of CDR. And thank you very much, Niall, wherever you are. Now I can't see you. Super good. Really, really good presentation. We tried to make our discussion as easy as possible, but this is extremely complicated. Role of the CDR, of course, certification scheme going forward, incentives, inclusion in voluntary markets, as we discussed, the possible inclusion in ETS, and of course also Article 4, and finally, how do we do with the targets? And these are the conclusions. Thank you, Galoran. Only one thing fell off the board, and maybe one of the most important items. So first of all, importance of definitions, importance of permanence, the MRV, and also when we define methodologies going forward and rules, let's start also here with the low-hanging fruits. So let's not wait until we know everything about all the CDRs. Let's take them from where something can be done. First of all, clarity regarding CDR. It is needed, not a question asked. The targets for 2040, first of all, the room voted. We would like to have separate targets to make it possible to drive this in the right direction. Reductions, removals, and also nature-based and technology-based separate. Article 6.4, of course, loads of support is needed for our European setup, and we would like to, in the longer term, to have harmonization. We also have several cases discussing where it's not that easy to do, but we would like to do this. Inclusion in markets, we discussed a little bit regarding inclusion in the EU ETS. It was obvious that the room was clear. We need the time to 2026 in order to really assess what is possible to move into to the EU ETS and why, and where do we need other solutions. And we heard several examples from DAX and BECS. So we really need to take the opportunity. We have homework to do in order to do this. We need to do things right. So there are different business cases, different business models to take into account. I've already talked about the permanence, and finally, just to highlight, we have to do it right, we have to do it now. It's about incentives on the one hand side, and it's about trust the other side. Happy if anyone else would like to highlight something I've missed, but that was what we discussed. Really energetic hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Per-Olof. Now let's move to my colleague Christina, who facilitated discussion on CCS markets, compare and contrast US and Europe.
Yes, thank you, Alina. Great. And so starting with the first slide, basically we talked about a number of different things, policy conditions needed to scale up, and just some high-level thoughts on what we discussed here. Not a clear line of sight for project revenue support and the potential for member state funding. We talked about experiences with CCS projects between Europe and the US, and multiple attendees noted that their investment focus had shifted to the US following the passage of the IRA, and that generally right now it is easier to deploy projects in the US from a permitting and funding standpoint in comparison to Europe. And also that there's broader political support for CCS deployment at the federal level for CCS in the US, again, compared to Europe. And so kind of following on the carrot and the stick bullet there, the carrot is moving projects forward in the near term, seemed to be the consensus of our group. And in terms of policies and strategies, I wanted to make a comment before I go to the next slide. The session was set up as a comparison between the US and Europe, but on many topics, it was noted by our attendees that the UK has made significant progress, and there are some valuable learnings from the UK policy approach that should be considered. So next slide. So here's 6 key insights and findings. So first of all, the need for the business case in Europe. The factors that were mentioned by our attendees, and remember this is feedback from our attendees, the relatively high energy costs in the EU, the fact that the EU ETS price uncertainty in comparison to the fixed value and timeline of the IRA can be a challenge when underwriting projects. Not seeing a premium in the market for lower CI products, and should procurement policies be considered there. And the fact that we need to ensure the business case so that projects can be developed in parallel with storage, because that will make it easier. Second bullet, moving to infrastructure, it was noted that there's limited planned build out for pipelines and other transport right now, and limited support for hub infrastructure right now specifically. In terms of the parameters of the Innovation Fund, while the Innovation Fund is of course welcomed, attendees asked, could we broaden the scope of how the funds can be used? Perhaps consider including more technologies and not making the innovation scope so tight, and then perhaps providing flexibility to allow for a market-driven value chain to come together instead of having to have it all in place when the submittals are made. In terms of value chain integration, attendees did not see the value chain as being integrated right now, making it difficult to pull projects together. And then how value chain risk is allocated. Should an emitter be solely responsible for storage risk at this point? And then just 2 more insights. Around member state differences, there's a challenge with lack of acceptance of CCS full stop across all member states. It's not an even landscape. And also noted that the EU member states have varying levels of expertise to regulate CCS. And so the thought was having an EU-wide minimum regulatory framework and consistency across member states would be helpful. And lastly, in terms of regulatory clarity, a couple topics came up, CDR, pipeline and transport specifications, as well as specifications for CO2 itself. It was noted that as projects are moving closer to deployment and proponents are trying to plan, the regulatory uncertainty around these topics remains and is a challenge. And so, again, for example, what's the value of CDR? What specifications should be used for CO2 and for its transport options? Thanks. Does anyone want to add anything?
Thank you, Christina. Yeah. So let's move to Andrei, who facilitated a group on a very important topic, public perception and creating value for CCS. This is something we touched on here, but not as much. So really curious to hear what the group talked about.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me here. It's all about public perception in the end, and the questions that were put on the table for the participants in the room dealt with the national experiences in relates to public perception, observed trends, key concerns, positive ways to address concerns with CCS, highlighting actions that have tried to change negative perceptions, and last but not least, steps to take and destigmatize CCS. And destigmatize is probably the right is probably the right expression, because it's been probably that's a mild word. What we've said is, or what I said, and it got caught into this conversation, this was not the favorite baby of the European institution, and somebody finally adopted this idea that this is the favorite baby word that kind of came around, and it was not the favorite baby. The same way the CBAM was not the favorite baby of the European institution, neither was this, and it's probably not uniform or among European institutions and among the European Commission. The perception we have is that different DGs have different preferences, different approaches to all this. It's all about perception and all about where you come from. So the key, we find a number of insights and findings. One of them is, the public perception is important. Why is it important? It's important because there are risks, and there are different type of risks related to safety of environment, and that is understandable. I mean, it's a technology. Somebody's going to put a pipe and dump something in your backyard. I mean, you're going to get alarmed by that, and those are very legitimate things to ask, and that people can have a conversation, and there have been people who have addressed this. There have been examples about project in Croatia done very well. So this is very encouraging. There's other type of conversation where it's an ideological thing and an opposition to CCS, which is a lot more difficult, but that's not perception. That is an ideological thing, and you deal with it in a different way. They're complex. It's not necessarily when the professor started putting those things with the graph and the decay and all this kind of stuff, I mean, I'm an engineer by my eyes kind of rolled over. And my question was, my question that came to mind, you said, talk about 100 years in a 200-year time horizon, why does it matter? I mean, to me, as an engineer, it doesn't really matter, but probably to all you folks in the room, it does matter. So it's a matter of perception. And also the fact that we're dealing with a very long time horizon that is very difficult to conceptualize for many people. And the institutional framework that exists in right now, political, economic framework, it simply never existed for that kind of time periods. Now, in terms of, this is not unique, however. So I think we're having a conversation, a difficulty in trying to conceptualize. We're having a discussion about public perception, in general, about public perception for CCS, because it is a case in point. But if you take, I come from a power company that was 60% nuclear, and as I said in the room, my kids used to play football in the shadow of the power station at Darlington in Toronto, and we're still alive and kicking. So, but it is clearly something that is not dissimilar. I mean, it is a technology that very people understand, perceive very, very risky, with long-term storage implications and so on and so forth. I remember when was it in the 90s, EMF was a big, big thing, and they were, in Italy, this was a complete no-no. NL was paralyzed because of EMF. They wouldn't do anything unless somebody addressed EMF. Large hydro. So there are a number of things like this that you have to compare in terms of the perception that people had. And why do you need this? Because you need a license to operate. It's as simple as this. And you need to have a social, it has become a very acceptable concept. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying it's become for the last number of decades. The fact that you need a social license to operate the emission trading system in Europe is the same thing. The moment you had things disappearing out of the registry, or somebody saying that this is not a ton of reduction or whatever it is, you basically destroy the whole system because of the perception. Sometimes it's not true, it's simply the perception, but it doesn't matter. The next thing that I wanted to also mention, what are some of the essential elements that you need to deal with this stuff? One of them is transparency. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. And the transparency is important. People will actually look at this, and the more transparent you are, the example I think that came in some case in Croatia that was given in the room, I was interested, I didn't know about it, became very illuminating and quite interesting. The second thing is, there are different countries in Europe with a very different tradition and different history. And the trust in government is very, very different. You know, I come from a place where we don't have a huge trust in government. There are other people who have a lot more trust in government, which is fine. But in that case, the political leadership plays an important role. Who will be the messenger in this? And the level of ambiguity in promoting this is extremely important. We're looking at Denmark, where the government has become very much involved in this. And there's a trust in a country like Denmark in the government. So that played I think it played an incredibly important role there. And then the cooperation with trusted actors. One of the things that we brought in, I mean, you try and tell people about climate change. I mean, you know, listen, I mean, this is a long, 100,000-year story, and somebody's emitting something you can't see, and he's going to do this, that, and the other thing to you, and by the way, you have to give up your cow and your car. I mean, that's a difficult one to sell. But the IPCC, a bunch of scientists, I mean, in the end, have managed to convince people that this is true. And as such, I think academia can play an important role. You know, there are institutions that are respected. You know, some academics are more respected than others, but there are certainly a lot of people in the academia and other such actors that need to be dealt with. The business model is also important. You know, electrification, for those of you who have ever been in this business, you know, the electrification was done publicly with public institutions that did this. All the electrification, whether it's Brazil or Canada, wherever it went, in the States, less so. But in most Europe, they're all in European state institution. But the business model of starting and having a public-private partnership at the beginning is an important one. Another thing is to take into consideration the local concerns and benefits. If people will see local benefits, then there's something that they can relate to, and that will have an impression on the public perception. And finally, societal values where the project is. There are different societal values, and what will fly in Eastern Europe into societal values is not going to fly in the Netherlands, and vice versa. You know, Europe is a very diverse place. You know, if you go to the States, yes, they speak with a funny accent in Louisiana and a different accent in Massachusetts, but the differences are not that high. You know, I'm not suggesting there are not, but they are not as if you go from Bucharest, if you go to Stockholm. I mean, the difference will be a lot more striking. Maybe they're being erased in time now, but they're still very, very strong. And the final thing is the understanding of the role of the regulator and the investor. Because I think we are looking. I come from Bonn. I drove for this session. I drove until 1 o'clock last night because I was coming from university negotiations in Bonn, and there was a paper issued for Article 6.4 and the Paris Agreement and removals. You know, that everybody went up in arms because they said, well, this is unsustainable, it's not sustainable, and it's not economical, and it's not this, that, and the other thing. My question was, listen, I mean, if it's not sustainable, I understand that we can have a discussion about that, but you're the bloody regulator. What's your problem, is economic or not? That's my problem. If I don't want to invest in it, I don't want to invest in it. But the regulators got to understand that cannot influence the perception of the instrument by the fact is economic or not. You can make a case that's not sustainable, which is probably not true in our opinion. But again, understanding the role and making sure that everybody keeps to his role, I think would help in the perception discussion. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Andrei. Sounds like your group covered a lot. Maybe we should use that group to resolve some of the complicated issues with CCS, with like names of people who joined that group. But now we move to Tim Dixon, who facilitated a group with a slightly more difficult task, because the group on COP28 was asked to come up with some actionable items. How can we all collaborate, coordinate, so that CCS is presented in a proper light at the COP28? So I hope there are some recommendations from this group.
Okay, thank you very much, Alina. And can I ask our expert, Nora Al-Amir, to come up and join me as well, because she deserves a lot of credit for the expertise she brought. And like Andrei, she's just come literally this morning from the COP, from this SB 58 meeting. While Nora's coming up, if I can just take the liberty of of a bit of clarification, because I was waving my hand this morning, but I wasn't. I was hidden by the podium.
Right.
It's another UN body, the London Protocol. There were some points made this morning about the ratification of the export amendment being a barrier. It's not a barrier, because we've got the provisional application in 2019 agreed, thanks to Norway and the Netherlands. And the requirements are the same, whether the original amendment's ratified or you use the provisional application. Countries have still got to do the bilateral agreement. And thanks to Denmark and Belgium for doing the first one and showing that it's not difficult, it's not detailed. So thanks to that. And then just on the last conversation on removals, really interesting question about ocean removal of CO2. The London Protocol again has a prohibition on geoengineering in the marine environment. They're very precautionary on that basis. They can be amended if we find one of the techniques is successful. But at the moment, all marine geoengineering is prohibited, except for research purposes. So just 2 points of clarification. Now onto the UNFCCC and the expectations towards COP28. And the first slide should have the questions that we were addressing. So if we can jump onto the second slide. So the topics to be highlighted. Now this is in the context, some of the group had been at COPs, and we know what a complex environment it is, what a rich environment with a range of views. And just the context setting, we do see some pushback against CCS and engineered CDR from some environmental NGOs there. So there are risks with things at COPs, and doing things at COPs, but there's also the benefits. The need for information is overwhelming from countries who are looking at CCS for the first time. So there's a really important role for all the organizations at COPs, such as the Global Institute, ourselves, University of Texas, CO2 GeoNet. It's really important roles. So in our group discussion, the first topic that came up that should be highlighted at COPs, storage safety. Now you might think we know all about this. Yes, but countries coming along or observers, NGOs coming along, this is the first question they always ask, and we always get asked it. And what's really good is that we do have regulations in existence to demonstrate storage security. We have the CDM, modalities procedures under the UNFCCC. We have London Protocol. We have ISO 2 standards now as well. The second topic to highlight is about whether we can create an international market for CCS. Now, I think we didn't get into the detail of this, but one, certainly we need to get it into the existing markets that are being created, such as Article 6.4 that Andrei mentioned, and that's a very hot area at the moment. But whether there's a market for some sort of storage credits in the future, the EU has its Net Zero Industry Act with a storage capacity making available type of thing within it. Could be one going forwards as well. The next point is to highlight the role of NDCs. The Paris Agreement is based upon each country determining for itself what it's going to do for mitigation. It's up to each country what technologies they choose, and there shouldn't be prescription on those countries. The next point is we should highlight the risks of not doing CCS. So we see all the analysis from the IEA and the IPCC, and the IPCC stopped showing I think in AR5 they showed the cost sensitivities of taking out low carbon tech, and the cost went up by 150% without CCS. They've stopped doing that, but that sort of point we should continue to make. The energy security linkages. CCS does have a role both in enabling countries to use their existing energy resources if they are fossil fuel countries with fossil fuel resources. But also, I don't know if Carl is still in here from the IEA from his presentation earlier, the ETP, Energy Technology Perspectives 2023, had a theme of looking at supply chain security and risks and challenges to that, looking at the critical minerals issues and concentration in certain countries. Well, CCS was conspicuous by its omission. It doesn't really get subject to the same challenges. Most countries have got steel industry, or if not, they can import in steel. And the countries, it's their own geology, they don't import that. And then the role of CCS in the just energy transition, emphasising that there's a debate in there about, from different perspectives, the oil and gas industry perspective or the sort of more greener perspective, but nonetheless, you know, there is a role for CCS in the just energy transition in ensuring jobs, continued all jobs migrate into being cleaner, greener jobs or new jobs. And the last point is North-South and South-South cooperation, this sharing of knowledge with developing countries who are interested in doing CCS, and particularly sharing between developing countries on their experiences. So ways to support the carbon management challenge. The only one really that we captured, Adam, sorry we didn't give you a long list here, but Germany, we had a member in the team from Germany, and they are looking at a new CCS strategy for Germany. And so they were mentioned as an example of a country that could join the 10 countries that are already supporting the carbon management challenge. And more countries are welcomed. And if you want to sign up, Adam's just there, and you saw Adam earlier. And then the last point was on coordination for COP28. Having a master list of CCS events and sharing that around the CCS organisations, that's that point. We try and do that anyway, but we often only find out about events at very late notice. So being able to find out and share earlier it would be a good thing. And then the second point there is the CCS Roundtable through the COP presidency. And that is because Nora, we're very honoured and privileged, not only that Nora made it here from Bonn this morning, but Nora is working with the COP presidency as well, and assisting them with their energy-related events and activities. And so potentially we could have a CCS roundtable as part of the COP presidency activities. And that would be very good, and we'd have coordination of all the like-minded CCS organisations in that. So that's the summary. Members of the group, do you want to add anything? Or does anybody have any? Nora, do you want to add anything?
I think you summarized it really well. I'll just maybe add a little bit of nuance. I think, like Andrei, I came from Bonn this morning, and I think just from my perspective, I don't know about you, Andrei, but it was one of the most intense, or the most intense Bonn session I've ever attended. And this has a lot to do with the conversation on the just energy transition. And really, I think the definition of what a just energy transition is, and it's very different for a lot of people. And I think this year is really an opportunity to look at to really kind of shape the CCS narrative and where it kind of fits in as a more general role towards the global shift, the global energy transformation. And actually, I also know Andrei from the inception of response measures, which is a very UN technical term for looking at the socioeconomic impacts of mitigation options and measures. So this is really where the kind of socioeconomic parts of CCS, I think conversations can be had, and there's kind of a really, really big focus there, I would say. And I think the other thing I would also just mention is the mitigation work program, which Jared, I don't know if this was already mentioned before, but Jared and Tim provided kind of a host of countries with feedback on CCS and answered all the questions there. But interestingly enough, that agenda item is still kind of contentious within the UNFCCC, because on one hand, developed countries want to see the acceleration of mitigation, but on the other hand, back to the financing conversation, developing countries think that these conversations should not be had without adequate financing. And that sort of delayed the agenda from even being adopted until late last night. And the compromise was to effectively drop the mitigation work program from this agenda from this year. So it kind of just shows, a lot of progress needs to be done, but I think among countries and regions, a lot of convergence needs to happen to really move forward on CCS and many other mitigation options as well. So thank you.
That's great, Nora. Thank you for that update. And on the global dialogue on the mitigation work programme that Nora just referred to, I'd just like to thank Jared for involving me as an expert alongside yourself. Jared and I answered questions from all the countries in the UNFCCC for over 5 hours on a Saturday. And Jared did it through the night, from his time zone. But what this gave us and demonstrated is the high level of interest. Countries are really interested in CCS, how they can do it, what are the requirements, well integrity issues. They got quite detailed at times, but there was a need for information provision at the COPs on this technology. So it was a really good exercise, and thank you, Jared, for involving me in that, and it reinforced why we all are so active as we are at the COPs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nora.
Very much. Thank you very much, Tim and Nora, and thank you, Andrei, Per-Olof, Christina. I also would like to acknowledge Jonas, who spoke on public perception, Ed Hart from Jonas from Bellona, Ed Hart from Clean Air Task Force, who was the speaker in the CCS markets, and Paul Zakur, who spoke on CDR. Thank you very much. We are running late, maybe 2 minutes for a question, but I would like to actually ask you, this is the first time we're doing the breakout sessions. Can we vote? How many of you would next year prefer to have breakouts, and who would prefer to have another panel with presentations and speeches? So let's vote. How many would prefer to break into groups as we did this year? Okay, looks a lot. We didn't count, but let's see visually. And who would prefer to have another session?
Not right now.
Not, so maybe some PhD students there. Okay, well, I think it's clear that people really enjoyed the breakouts, and we picked up a lot of your thoughts. So thank you very much for participating, for contributing. Thank you, our facilitators and speakers. So any very quick questions from the group to the facilitators? If not, I think people had a very busy, packed day. So let me turn over to Jared to conclude today.